Stress is natural. More in depth, stress and trauma are a part of the human experience. Oftentimes, stress and trauma catch us off guard, causing us to become unfamiliar versions of ourselves. In my opinion, stress and trauma are inevitable. Yet, I am confident that we can prepare ourselves with mindsets, skills, and knowledge to minimize the impact that potential stress and trauma can have on our hearts, minds, spirits, physical, and mental health. This is Project Heal. So we actually started this trauma-informed live stream conversation right in the middle of the pandemic. The pandemic happened and I still wanted to travel across the nation. Project Heal has partners in 14 states and I wanted to see the people, but we couldn't because it was actually a very, very high health risk. The summer of 2020, we decided to launch a live stream. A group of friends of mine pushed me to have the conversation around trauma-informed education virtually. And I accepted the fact that bringing the message to people in the confines of their home was the right thing to do. And so here we are, resuming the conversation virtually so that more people can join in on the dialogue. Right? And thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, I'm Johnny, president and founder of Project Heal, this national mental health organization. But can you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Daisha. I am from New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm currently a physics teacher for high school students. I've been teaching for about 3 years now. I love being in the classroom, and I love the experience that I have had with Project Heal. So I'm here today.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for coming. So why do you think it may be important to have this conversation around stress, trauma, and mental health today?
I think today, especially with a lot of us living through a global pandemic, I think that conversation is really important. I mean, I think the conversation around mental health was always important, but now more than ever, and we see it. We see it in our daily lives. We see it with our families, with our friends, with our students,
Definitely.
with our coworkers. It's just a conversation that needs to be had between people so that way we can be there for each other.
Yeah. And so to share a little bit about my perspective, I didn't think I was going to make it through the pandemic. Right? Because I am an extrovert. And so I literally needed to be surrounded around people who I care, I love about to fill my cup. Zoom, Google Chat, and FaceTime was traumatic for me because it was literally a demonstration of love that I couldn't access in person. I grew up on the south side of Chicago as a little black boy in a really big family, and love was all I knew. Growing up, I didn't really have the verbiage to say that was traumatic or that was stressful. Granted, I experienced trauma at a very early age, but I didn't really know what trauma was. And so I have to say that having conversations around the literal phrase of mental health definitely happened with me going to college at a predominantly white institution.
Yeah.
And I had white friends talking about mental health. It wasn't even black friends or Latino friends or
Same. That was my same experience. Yeah, for sure.
So we're both teachers, and so I'm curious to know why might you think the topic of stress, trauma, and mental health might be an important conversation to have for teachers and school staff?
I think that, and I stress this, this was a conversation that we always should have been putting first.
Right.
But especially now in a pandemic, you just see a total shift in students and how they perform and how they behave and how they react to things that would normally just be small situations, but you see them kind of being blown a little bit out of proportion.
Right.
And I think that a lot of that has to do with trauma. They're being affected by it in many ways, like I wouldn't even be able to fully wrap my mind around what my students go through outside of school, especially living in the time that they live in. Like, we're living in a global pandemic. You're living in a time where social media is everything. Like, the things that normal teenagers would go through, you're still dealing with, but you have like a million other things on top of that.
Right.
And so I really think like that conversation is important, because I think like if our students' mental health isn't a priority, like, how can they focus on school? How can they be successful?
Right.
Like, mind and body is
Right.
something that's really important in all aspects.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I think when I hear conversations of mental health, or when I imagine conversations of mental health being left out of dialogue in schools and communities, it literally makes me think of how communities devalue the mind, or don't know how to value the mind, or more specifically, we weren't educated on brain health, right? Because from pre-K all the way up to us being adults, like, we know PE, we know physical health, we know how to play basketball, we know about recess at a very early age, and we know about Planet Fitness, 24-hour fitness, OTF, what is it, Orange Theory Fitness, like, we know about all of these things as adults, but there's a smaller number of people who understand the significance of brain health, right? The brain doesn't really know how to distinguish between physical and emotional pain, and I don't think we do at times either. Right? And so that makes me think much more about like Project Heal nationally, right? And so, as you very well know, like, we have trauma-informed education for parents, caregivers, and mental health education for students. And of course, we do trauma-informed education for schools and school staff. And so, having been a participant of Project Heal's trauma-informed education, what inspired you to participate?
I think for me, and not just me, I think also the staff at my school, I think we all saw a shift in our students, and not just our students, ourselves as educators. Like, our performance this year was just completely different, you know, and that comes from a lot of different stressors, like we said, our number one thing, living in a global pandemic, being in the classroom one year, out the classroom another, hybrid, and then back in the classroom, and then you have students dealing with family members who have unfortunately like passed away because of this global pandemic, and just seeing like them not being the same students that they once were. And of course everybody grows, but you just see that something is different. You can see like our kids are being affected by this in tremendous ways.
Yes.
And a lot of people thought like, you know, bringing them back to school was the fix.
Right.
But the fix is beyond that, right?
Yes.
Like having them in the building is one thing, but what are we doing to take care of them while they're here?
Yes.
And so I think that's why I was really, really excited when I learned that. I think that's really important because we have to look out for them.
Right. I think so thank you for sharing that. It's quite vulnerable and it's equally profound, because at the essence of what you were sharing is that before the pandemic, like, teachers recognized behaviors, right? And then the pandemic occurred, and then as we navigated the pandemic, teachers still recognized behaviors, but those behaviors were, to an extent, exacerbated.
Right.
But through a conventional lens, we recognize behaviors and we try to solve the issue. But through a trauma-informed lens, we recognize that behaviors are a request to have a need met. And so if we think through a trauma-informed lens and think about, this behavior is showing me that a student has a need that is unmet, then we can understand that if we help the student meet the need, then the behavior will subside. And the very fact that the behaviors worsened or exacerbated simply means that, or is indicative that the need that the student has been going on for such an extended period of time that they no longer know what to do. Right? And I think, in my mind, I don't think that's a problem. I think that's demonstrative of a great opportunity for us to take a step back and figure out, how do we meet the students' needs.
Absolutely. That's our job.
Right. Literally, that's our job as educators,
job.
as people, you know, generally speaking. And so I'm curious to know, I want to shift gears here a little bit. What are students, from your perspective as an educator, what might students be missing as we think through support or supportive services that they could benefit from in school that could like improve their mental health?
Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is social. You know what I mean? Like I think like you spend so much time in this pandemic just being isolated from like your friends, from your teachers, going to school online. Like they didn't have that social interaction for so long. All they had was their homes and the people in their homes. And I think after a while, it changes you. You know, as an adult, it changed me. So I can't even imagine what children are going through.
It rocked my world.
Yeah, like
I'm different.
And I'm very introverted. I was happy when I was like, oh, we're going to school online. Like, this is the greatest news I've ever heard. But after a year, I was losing my mind. And if I can't process it, I can't expect them to process what we've been through.
I'm still messed up today.
Yeah, currently, I haven't recovered. I'm still exhausted. I'm still tired.
Yeah.
And so I know that they are. I see it in them. I see that they're exhausted. I see that they're trying to maintain these friendships at school, and it's harder now than what it was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
They're struggling and they need help. And I think like as educators, we needed the tools to help our kids. Yeah. Because if we're not helping them, where are they going to get the help from?
Yeah, no, you're right. And then also, like, I also think, as I think about us as educators, having been educators in the city of Las Vegas, and me having been an educator in like other cities like Chicago and LA, it makes me think more expansively, right? To the parents who may be listening, and makes me think more expansively that like learning how to understand stress and trauma is beyond the four walls of the classroom, right? Teachers and students must understand trauma, stressors, mental health, and such. Parents and caregivers must understand trauma, stress, so on and so forth.
Right.
The entire community. Because any absence of a trauma-informed lens in today's society, it could cost a student their life. It could cost a parent and caregiver their life.
Yeah.
The Attorney General of Health in the United States just named that like we are experiencing a youth mental health crisis right now. And it's not as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic is, in my opinion, making us focus on it. Yeah. Where, in my opinion, it's been a student mental health crisis prior to COVID.
Yeah.
This situation, this pandemic situation, social inequities like racism, systemic overt racism, is simply compounded on top of what already existed, and it's impacting all of us.
That's true.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And I also think that as teachers, we have an extremely important job to focus on ourselves first, and then on the students second. So why is it important to have boundaries or to practice very clear boundaries as a teacher when you're prioritizing your mental health?
I think it's important for a teacher to have boundaries because if you don't set them, I mean, kids don't really understand them yet. And so when you have your students, like they'll overwhelm you in a sense. And it's not like it's something that they're doing on purpose. They don't know. They're going to the nearest adult that will listen to them, that's there for them. And I really am proud of myself for being that adult and having my students feel comfortable enough to talk to me. But at the same time, I understand the importance of having those boundaries, especially when you teach 200 kids. Yeah. Can't take on everyone's problems. And it's very hard to hear myself say this as an adult, but also like I'm a human above everything else. And so I think those boundaries literally, especially in a year like this, are make or break. And one thing that I am very proud of with boundaries is also teaching my students how to set boundaries.
Excellent.
I remember I had a student and he's very empathetic, and so if I'm having a rough day or if his friend next to him is having a rough day, like he feels it, he takes it on, and he won't stop until like it's fixed. And I just remember, like talking to him, asking like, how do you feel? How are you doing?
Right.
Because you're always there for other people, but whoever asks you like, how are you? How are you feeling? And just kind of working with some of my students on setting those boundaries I think was a plus this year, because we have to learn, like, yes, it is important that we are there for each other, but it also is important that we prioritize ourselves first.
Yes.
Because you can't be an effective friend or teacher or sister or brother for somebody if you can't take care of yourself.
Right. Now, I applaud you for sharing that, and I also applaud you for actually practicing that. And so I heard a lot as I was listening to you, and there were like a number of things that stood out, and I'm going to go down a list. The first thing that stood out was, obviously, you're a teacher, and you teach your students how to basically put themselves first and set boundaries. But as a teacher, you teach academic intelligence. But what you just explained was modeling and supporting your students in practicing advancing their emotional intelligence. As teachers, like we teach academic intelligence, but what you just explained, that you support your students and you model for your students advancing their emotional intelligence, right? Because setting boundaries is an emotionally intelligent way to maintain healthy mental health. The second thing you discussed, setting the boundaries, and as I listened, it made me think about hygiene, right? We wake up in the morning, we brush our teeth, we make sure we look good, we make sure we smell good, but that's all associated with physical hygiene. Setting boundaries helps us maintain healthy mental hygiene. And so setting a boundary is literally a physical practice, a physical and like metaphorical practice of like cleansing your mind from receiving an overwhelming amount of stress. And that's extremely important. That's extremely important. So to the teachers who are listening, as it relates to like setting boundaries and mental health and teacher mental health, what message would you share with them?
One thing that's really important is to think of this journey as ongoing. Don't think of it as there is a finish line. Like you're on this journey, you should think of it as kind of like a cycle. Like you're constantly learning, you're constantly changing it, or changing how you do things. Setting boundaries is really hard. It's difficult, especially when you're responsible for multiple children. Like at times you can feel like overwhelmed, or you can feel like I have to do this. And to some extent, you know, like you need to listen to your kids. You need to provide them with the resources that are necessary, but also understand that you are human and you're a teacher, and we're not mental health professionals. So sometimes all we can do is just be that teacher and to be that person that gets the students the resources that they need. But like I said, like that journey can be very difficult, and everybody does it in a different way. And so I would say, like, just be gracious to yourself as you are going through that journey, because it is hard, and sometimes you are going to go home and you are going to cry yourself to sleep thinking about the million of ways that you could have handled something better. But I think it's really important that we give ourselves a break and that we're gracious to ourselves and understanding that, like I said, this is a cycle. I mean, it's a learning experience, and we're not perfect. But the fact that you're trying and you're going above and beyond for your students, I think means a lot. It means the world.
Absolutely. You teachers, y'all heard that, right? Right. It's not your responsibility to save your student. Just support your student in growing and developing into the best academic and emotionally intelligent version of themselves, and then support them in identifying healthy coping mechanisms. Because my teachers didn't save me; they simply supported me in the process of learning academically and also emotionally, to figure out how I could be the best version of myself. And I think I turned out all right. All right. So as we prepare to close our conversation, I wanted to ask a couple more questions about your experience with the Project Heal Trauma-Informed Education. So what content and tools did you find most supportive as you learned as a participant of the Project Heal Trauma-Informed Education pathway?
Oh, there were a lot. One of my favorites was the mood thermometer. I love that tool. My kids love just being able to identify how they feel. Thermometer. The emotional thermometer. We love that. And then I just added like a piece to it where sometimes I give them like a chance to journal. Like, why do you feel that way? And I tell them like, I'm not gonna check it. Like, it's personal. This is between you and like your innermost thoughts. And they really like take to it. They really get engaged with it. And I think like that's just a really good social and emotional tool to have in the classroom.
For audience members, can you let them know what the emotional thermometer is? Can you explain to them?
Yes. So the emotional thermometer is like this little placard that our students could use to identify how they're feeling for the day. And so like on one part of the thermometer, it can be like an emoji that's like upset or sad or angry. And then on the other end, it's like an emoji that's really happy or excited. And I believe that it has numbers on it. And so kids can write down the number of the emoji that they're feeling like for the day.
What's the benefit of the emotional thermometer?
I think the benefit of the emotional thermometer is for the students to be able to identify how they feel. I think it's really great for me as a teacher to see how my students are feel. Like if they're having a bad day, I do not want to make it worse, and it's okay to have a bad day. I think it's just a really great social and emotional tool, so that way we know how we can support each other throughout the day.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. And again, so there's that element of you as the teacher facilitating academic intelligence, but the emotional thermometer actually like ameliorates the emotional intelligence of the entire classroom. Yeah. Right?
It's cool. And sometimes it's a conversation starter, you know?
Yes.
Like I can tell like if one of my students is having a bad day, you can automatically see like their classmate or the person that's sitting next to them trying to do things to make them feel better or maybe give them some space because they just may need some space. I think it's really great with helping us knowing how to support each other through daily, activities, through daily things. Yeah.
No, I think it's extremely important. So, like, with all that being said, would you recommend Project Heal's Trauma-Informed Education to another teacher, school leader, or parent and caregiver?
Absolutely. I learned so much from the Trauma-Informed Education series. I learned a lot about how to support my students, but also how to support myself, which is something I was struggling with a lot this year. And so I love that the education experiences gave me the tools that I need to be not only a great teacher, but the best version of myself. And it taught me some ways to fill my cup too, which was really helpful when I was struggling over the first few months when we started.
Yeah. All right. Well, those are all the questions I have. Do you have any questions for me?
Let's say like you're going through a tough time, right?
Oh, okay.
How are you able to continue to, like facilitate these when you may be going through a tough, because like especially through our professional development, sometimes teachers use that as a venting space, and then you're taking on that, and so how do you handle those situations when you're facilitating like the professional developments?
It's a very good question. And I think that question is in direct alignment to what you said, having boundaries. Yeah. Right? You stated that as a teacher, you had to learn how to set up boundaries for yourself and your students, right? Because you had also empathetic students, and if that empathetic student took in everything from one of their friends, it would, to an extent, break them. Truthfully, I've experienced an obscene amount of trauma at a very early age, and in my opinion, I think that it has positioned me to have a very strong, like, emotional, like, mental, like, I think the amount of trauma that I experienced at a very early age has like positioned me to be like just like fortified mentally and emotionally, to an extent to keep me doing this work. Now let me be clear, I am human. Yeah. Right? I have limitations. I am overwhelmingly empathetic to the point where in which I know when I've had too much. And that's practicing boundaries. So for example, I'll be clear to the audience members, like as a kid, I witnessed domestic violence, right, between my mother and my stepfather. And then I witnessed that domestic violence transferred over, right, into a number of my other family members. And then as a child, I felt hopeless, right? And then at a very early age, my best friend passed away, right? And that was my dog. I like love my dog, right? And then I was bit in the face by a dog to the point where in which I had to get like 15 stitches, and then they put me in a straitjacket, right? And I felt hopeless and like restricted. And I always associated the stress and trauma that I experienced by getting bit by a dog and having to get 15 stitches in my face to my childhood and feeling hopeless. But as I grew up, I began to experience more love than childhood trauma. And I think that made me want to live in a world where in which I can help people realize that experiencing trauma doesn't always have to be a crippling experience, right? When I was in college, like my older brother was murdered, right? And like 2 days before, like I got a phone call saying that my brother was murdered. Like my brother called me and said, "Yo, can you give me a few dollars so that I can take a bus from Chicago to Michigan?" And then he took a bus from Chicago to Michigan somehow, and then like I got a phone call a few days later saying that like he had passed away. And so till this day, phones give me anxiety, right? Every time I see a phone ring, I am like traumatized because it makes me go all the way back to that moment. And so I share all of this with you because at any given moment, I'm always confronting the stress and trauma that I have experienced. And I think that fortifies me mentally than crippling me emotionally, right? And I think oftentimes we practice, and I, myself included, we practice pocketing our emotions. And when you pocket your emotions, imagine how heavy you may feel walking around, right? Imagine how heavy your mind might feel. Imagine how heavy your heart might feel. But when you make it a routine to consistently cleanse your mind of heavy emotions, you have more capacity to receive the stress or heaviness of others' emotions.
Yeah.
Right? Think of your heart, your mind as a bag. Right? And as you have conversations with people, they pour their heavy emotions into your bag. Yeah. But if you aren't taught how to practice like releasing that bag, you will always feel heavy and overwhelmed. Yeah. I think what I have been divinely gifted with is an immense ability to consistently risk my heart, my mind, my spirit of heavy emotions. But I have reached a moment where like I've reached my capacity. Yeah. Right? Like during COVID, I facilitated 75 trauma-informed education sessions in one room of my home, right? Facilitated 75 sessions, and on average, there were anywhere between 100 to 150 people on Zoom. So imagine if I facilitated like 3 sessions a week, that's like 300 people worth of stress and trauma that I'm acquiring on my heart, my mind. Yeah. And so when I realized that I reached my limit, I would write music, I would record music, and I would play the saxophone as a means to cleanse my mental hygiene. And I think that like this conversation is extremely important because oftentimes people think that the people who do the work are like absolved from experiencing the stress, the trauma, and all of the messiness that is associated with like experiencing emotions. So I say all that to say, I too am human. With 49 partnerships in 14 states, it is now time for me to build a team of trauma-informed specialists. So everyone who's listening, if you're interested and want to learn how to facilitate trauma-informed education, send us an email and I will gladly train you so that the trauma-informed body, the trauma-informed movement grows. Because the reality of the circumstance is this: stress and trauma is a natural part of life. It's inevitable, right? But we can not prevent it, but we can undeniably prepare ourselves with healthy, culturally relevant tools to cleanse our minds, our hearts, our spirits. Stress and trauma is a natural part of life, right? And it is inevitable. We cannot prevent it, but we can definitely prepare ourselves. And members of my team will definitely invite you to send your resume, express your interest, and we'd gladly coach more trauma-informed consultants because the demand for the work far outweighs the number of people who are readily available to facilitate the services. I practice a very healthy boundary to put myself in a position to be first empathetic, to suspend judgment, to thirdly extend grace, and know that the individuals who are participating in the experience are learners. And so there have been a number of times where I've been facilitating a session. There may be 250 people in a room, and something that someone has said triggered me. Made me think about the passing of my brother, or the domestic abuse that I experienced as a child, or even like getting bit in the face by a dog. But the reality of my circumstance is that I have advanced my emotional intelligence to the extent where I know how to compartmentalize when I feel triggered. I know what my emotional threshold is. And so I can't facilitate trauma-informed education in the month of March because that's my birthday, that's my brother's birthday, and it always makes me think about like him not being here for another year, right? That level of emotional intelligence and like understanding who I am establishes a boundary for me to maintain healthy mental health. What I've learned through facilitating trauma-informed education is that I am too an ongoing learner, and that it helps unearth triggers and emotional thresholds for myself included, in addition to the participants who choose to go through the learning experience. And it's always a mentally healthy experience for me as I'm consistently learning more about myself and the participants. And I'll close with this. At the conclusion of all of my sessions, I'm exhausted, like 110%. Like I may only have enough like fuel to go for 90 minutes, but I feel like I use fuel to go for 120 minutes. And then afterwards, I'm depleted, right? I need a week to recover from facilitating one trauma-informed education session, which is why it's time to build a team. Daisha, thank you so much for joining us on the Project Heal TV show, and we look forward to having you continue the ongoing conversation with us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely,
This is
absolutely.
great.
Thank you.